How do we uncover patterns that are hidden deep within our data? Connections are so subtle that traditional tools can't even see them, and yet they're so powerful that they can shape everything from political discourse to fraud prevention. Well, in this episode, I'm joined by Jim Webber from Neo4j, and together we're going to explore the rise of graph databases and their expanding role in both enterprise innovation and even AI development. And Neo4j's technology has been used to expose complex webs of deception, whether that be from coordinated misinformation in political advertising to financial scams that affect the most vulnerable. And while headlines like that grab the most attention, the deeper story here is about how graph databases can help organisations map the real world more accurately than ever before. So today we're going to unpack why many global enterprises are placing Neo4j right at the core of their business systems, how Klarna is reimagining customer service with knowledge graph-powered agents, and what it means for AI tools to have a reliable contextual foundation that reduces hallucinations and boosts data-driven decision-making. And as more CEOs demand clear AI strategies, the question becomes not whether your business should adopt AI, but whether your data is ready for it. So is your infrastructure capable of supporting intelligent systems that can reason, adapt, and act? Well, let's find out what graphs really can do, and also why they're quickly becoming the quiet powerhouse behind smarter AI. And for that, I need to officially introduce you to today's guest. So a massive warm welcome to the show. Can you tell everyone listening a little about who you are and what you do?
Yeah, thanks for having me on, Neil. It's really nice to be here and a pleasure to be on a podcast with a fellow Midlander finally after all these years. So my name is Jim Webber. I am a computer scientist and I work at Neo4j, the graph database company. And I've been the chief scientist at Neo4j for almost the last 15 years.
Fantastic. Well, it's a pleasure to have you on here. The Midlanders unite today. And one of the things I wanted to talk about, we're going to have a bit of fun today, but in serious matters, misinformation, financial fraud seem to be growing concerns. It's everywhere in our news feeds right now, especially in election years, which we've seen a lot of recently. So how did Neo4j's graph database technology, how did it help uncover coordinated scams in political advertising? Because you uncovered quite a few things here, right?
Yeah, so this is the IDJC work that we did with the University of Syracuse in the US. And it was the first time these folks had used graph technology. So it was really interesting to see what folks who were quite adept at, kind of data could do when presented with graphs. And at the most basic level, what a graph allows you to do is connect facts together. So you've often seen on the TV in police procedural TV shows where they have a board, photographs and pieces of string, the photographs and bits of evidence. And that's a graph, right? That's entities connected via relationships. And on a board that the police investigative team would use, you can maybe stack up a few tens of items and a few dozens of connections between those items before things get controlled. It becomes a spider's web or a compost very quickly from a human point of view. But that model is really nice, right? It's very simple, things connected to things. I could say that Jim is from Birmingham. Neil lives in Wolverhampton. Neil is from Derby, but Wolverhampton is next to Birmingham. I can capture all of this kind of complexity of the real world very simply. And what a graph database allows you to do is capture all that stuff at enormous scale. So what the researchers over at Syracuse did was that they started to capture advertising spend during the US election campaign. And the hypothesis going into it was potentially you find some coordinated dark actors that are trying to unduly influence the US election, which was a pivotal election, right, between Harris and Trump, with a lot of both domestic and international stakeholders. Instead, what actually came out of the graph, the patterns that were emerging, were much less about kind of dark actors and state intervention that were trying to meddle with the election. I think the US is increasingly secure about that, given its history. But what started emerging with these kind of commercial attacks, if you like, on the US citizens, predominantly around conning politically engaged people out of their money. So as an example, you would be able to go to one of these coordinated websites, and it turns out that the kind of MAGA faction in US politics is very civically engaged, very engaged with the political process. And therefore, they're quite susceptible to advertising. If you want a MAGA mug, put your name and email address in here and give us your credit card number for postage and packaging. And then there's some small print that says, oh, and we'll also bill you monthly for the next N months, a big chunk of money. And this wasn't just a one-off. This was, it turns out, a web of coordinated actors trying to steal money from a civically engaged part of the population. And that, I think, was really interesting, right? Because I would have gone into this expecting to find other things, but actually we were finding criminality kind of parasitic on the population of voters and defrauding people who were perhaps most susceptible to it.
Absolutely phenomenal what you've achieved here, what you've uncovered, and especially when traditional data analysis often struggles with detecting hidden connections. So I've got to ask, how do graph databases provide an advantage in identifying patterns that ultimately expose these bad actors that we're talking about here?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's primarily down to the data model. So we've seen a lot of great databases over the years, right? So for much of my existence, the database was a relational database. And that data model is that we store things in tables with rows and columns. And then as you get more advanced, you get to figure out how to glue these tables together. We call them joins. But ultimately, what you build is a big table. And then from that big table, you kind of filter out the results that you want. And that's quite hard to spot patterns of connectivity there, to be honest. It's like being presented with a huge spreadsheet and being asked to kind of form a social graph or something from it. It's pretty hard. Yeah. And we've also seen some really competent databases around the kind of NoSQL stack, kind of column family databases, key value stores, I guess things like MongoDB, famously a kind of document store. And these are amazing data models for the jobs that they do. For example, MongoDB is an incredible simplification of a data model that allow us to do these kind of store retrieve tasks wonderfully easily without any friction. But again, they don't have this idea of connectivity. So it's really hard to see how things are associated with each other. Relational has a little bit of that with its joins, but it never really was intended for that. And then the data model that fits this picture are graphs, where you have entities that can be connected to any other entity via any number of relationships, arrows, if you like, or joins if you're algebraically inclined, so that you can capture the messiness of the real world in high fidelity without working against the grain of the model. Right? If you try and do this in relational, you have to do all kinds of recursive join craziness, and eventually your queries kind of just run out of horsepower. If you're trying to do this as a document, you kind of have to fake it up. And when you remove one document, you leave things dangling and it's horrible. So the only kind of class of data systems that we have today that can deal with this massive network data, if you like, the graph databases. And so that's why they're often chosen, where you want to be able to deal with the messiness of the real world in high fidelity, and then kind of comb over that data, looking and learning about patterns that exist in it, so that you can use those patterns either to stop bad activity or to, in a more general kind of enterprise sense, be able to take advantage of those patterns to improve the running of the operations and running of your own business.
And Gartner famously predicted that, I think by this year, 80% of data and analytics innovations will all use graph technologies. So for people pretty new to this, what is it that makes graph databases so essential, especially for the future of data-driven decision-making, which it seems every business is rightly obsessed about right now?
Yeah, I think there's a few forces here. So I think Gartner's an interesting nuance. When we started Neo4j, what feels like 1,000 years ago, Gartner really weren't that interested in the category. Gartner are very much about helping mature enterprises make good decisions. And so when we first started with this, and you're kind of telling people about the benefits that graph could give us, Gartner were kind of like, yeah, kind of come and talk to us when you're a serious proposition. Fast forward to 2025, and as you rightly say, Gartner are now saying that graphs are a serious proposition. I think that's definitely one force that's happened. Graphs have landed in the enterprise because enterprise data is messy. It's no longer the 1970s where everyone has the same job description, the same pay and benefits, and that's very homogeneous. Nowadays, data is very heterogeneous, right? There's lots of things going on in your data. Even our payroll records, our medical records, all the things that you might naively think are pretty much the same person to person. So data has exploded in its kind of personalized nature and its highly associative nature. We run our social lives on these networks of highly heterogeneous data, Twitter, LinkedIn, all that kind of stuff. That's one force, right? Data is messy, and in order to get value from that messy data in the modern enterprise, you need a data model and a database that can store it. The other part of that, I think, is much more recent, and that comes from the AI side of the world, right? So AI has been in the middle of a winter forever for most of my professional lifetime. And suddenly in the last kind of 5 years, it's exploded. And in the last 2 and a bit years, really, with generative AI, it's exploded through the roof. But in order to fuel your AI systems, you can't just allow one of these foundational models to suck in your data and run riot, right? You're going to get these foundational models to do worthwhile things for your business, then you have to be able to give them context, either by prompt engineering or fine tuning, or more notably by RAG, Retrieval-Augmented Generation. And what people are finding there is that if you're going to give a foundation model some context, you want to give it the best quality tokens that you can. And the best quality tokens tend to come from graph databases because those connections in the data give you just higher quality context for those interactions. As an example, Neil, I'm a Black Country boy. You're an adopted son of Wolverhampton. If I was to encode that into vectors, then all we might get in that vector is some vague geographic notion that Hampton is part of the Black Country and we're near Birmingham, that kind of thing, right? Not really very rich. But if I was to encode that in a graph, I would see that Wolverhampton is in the Black Country, as is West Bromwich, my birthplace. We'd be able to see that Wolverhampton and West Bromwich are rivals in football, and we both hate Birmingham, right? Especially the Villa, apparently. And so that's far richer than you'd get from these kind of pithy vector approaches. And feeding that into as the context into your foundation model is going to give you some much richer answers, much more accurate answers. So I think it's that dual pressure, Neil, that we're seeing. Like, graphs are amazing for the kind of data we're dealing with nowadays. And that goes hand in glove with the fact that AI is pushing on graph data for increasingly better quality answers.
And if we look beyond misinformation, which we mentioned a few moments ago in our conversation, what other industries do you see benefiting from graph database technology, particularly in things like fraud detection or maybe even cybersecurity?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really awful question to ask me, so thank you for that. It used to be a really easy question to answer in 2012. So in 2012, we knew exactly what graph databases were good for, and they were adding social to your app and anything to do with telecommunications or data networks. And I would be happy to chat to you about Twitter and people like Cisco and so on and how they use graphs. But actually in 2025, it's a hard question because graphs play a very horizontal role. There isn't a single industry in the world that hasn't been touched by graphs. You mentioned things like cybersec. All of the big cybersec companies use graphs. You talk about things like fraud detection or the inverse of fraud detection, which is product recommendation. Again, all of the big financial companies, all of the big retail companies, they're all using graphs in some way, shape or form to be able to either block bad activity or promote good activity. The stats are insane. Neo4j serves the majority of the G2000 at this point. So these are serious businesses who need to get on with the serious day job of running their business and making a profit for their stakeholders. And they choose graphs not because they're some kind of whiz-bang fancy technology that the nerds want to play with, but because graphs solve real problems in their businesses now.
Wow, absolutely phenomenal. For say you didn't want to answer that, or it was difficult to answer, you did a fantastic job there. And of course, we've done brilliantly. This is a tech podcast. We've not mentioned AI or hardly mentioned it, but one of the things that Gartner also predicted last year was agentic AI is expected to take over the entire workflows in enterprises throughout 2025. How does graph technology enhance those AI agents that seems to be all anyone's talking about right now, and ultimately ensure that they make reliable and context-aware decisions? Because that is something that we often see enterprises get wrong, but it is changing. So how do you see this panning out?
Yeah, so I think it is a hot topic, right? Agentic AI. And agentic AI is where the agents are allowed to use tools, right? And whether that is interacting with a database or interacting with APIs, it's effectively empowering an AI system to change the state of the system, which is quite different from your earlier AI where it was kind of chatty, but we wouldn't necessarily trust it to press any buttons. So what we're experiencing here are a maturity in both the way that the foundational models themselves are improving in capability, and also in terms of the way that we're starting to build AI systems. But the fundamental problem of hallucination does not go away here, right? So if you have an agentic system where you've got some foundation model that's able ultimately, an agent using a foundation model that's ultimately able to use tools, you still need to provide good context for that agent in order for it to do its job well. Now, people can argue about this and say, well, look, I can fine tune that problem away, or I can prompt engineer that away. And then that's partly true. But actually, for agents to be really very useful, for example, in a simple, let's say an e-commerce like scenario, something like Amazon.com, where I want to buy a pair of headphones, it's no good having that agent, that AI system trained on data that's historic, even if it was only yesterday's data, because I will then ask for a pair of headphones. It will then duly go through the motions using the tools and APIs that it can interact with in order to process that, only to find actually that there were no headphones in stock. So whatever basic premise we have, databases are going to play a part in this because they inject real-time data into the process. But then it comes back to, okay, what about the quality of that real-time data? If we're really going to get agents to be accurate, or to at least minimize the kind of bad variance in it, the kind of hallucinatory part of it, we need to provide good context to those agents. And the underlying platform that people are increasingly choosing for that is a knowledge graph. Again, this idea that we can lay out facts connected in a network at large scale. And one of the tools that the agent can have at its disposal is being able to interact with this knowledge graph, which can, of course, contain not only things like my inventory stock, that's a very basic knowledge, but all of the relationships between them. For example, an agent that's trying to sell me headphones should be able to detect that I'm out of stock of the brand exact thing that I want, but be able to, through the knowledge graph and through reasoning, be able to say, hey, look, we're out of stock of headphone X, but headphone Y would suit you very well. So why don't you buy that instead? And be able to take on that workflow, as Gartner phrased it, to be able to encourage me to buy those headphones, even though it's actually a difficult reasoning process to do that. Without the correct data, without the correct context from the underlying knowledge graph, that's going to be impractical or impossible. So really what the knowledge graph is providing is the raw fuel to ensure that Gartner's vision of agents owning entire end-to-end workflows can come true.
And the elephant in the room, of course, is that very real concern around AI agents, that their ability to act independently and sometimes make unpredictable choices can be quite worrying for any enterprise in any industry. So how can businesses better implement safeguards to control and correct those AI actions in real time? Can't believe here we are in 2025 talking about AI going rogue on us, but any advice around that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think we're quite at Skynet yet. I don't think anyone's wiring it up to the missiles just yet. Who knows? But yeah, you're right. So what we have to understand that this isn't strictly an AI problem. This is a systems problem. And no one in their right mind is allowing these kind of raw foundational models to kind of dictate, next best action and that kind of stuff. That would be insane. So any system that involves AI is also going to involve other things. And the challenge for enterprises is to allow a level of hallucination, if you like, or at least creativity from the AI, so that you get kind of human-like responses from it, but to fuel that with enough hard facts such that it doesn't speculate. AIs speak very confidently. They will tell you lies very, very, very confidently, even when they don't actually understand themselves that they are telling lies. And AIs are a bit like that. So the safeguards that we have, again, it's this context data. If we can give the AIs great context, then it reduces their propensity to hallucinate. And if we reduce their propensity to hallucinate below a threshold, then we can safely use that within that envelope to start powering systems. But this isn't a trivial thing, right? This is something that systems engineers like myself have to think about and implement carefully and measure so that we can then safely put those agents into play carefully as part of our end-to-end processes. But this isn't a kind of switch on OpenAI's API, pay the money with your credit card and go. This, I think, to be safe, and again, safe depends on the industry that you're in, but to be safe, this is part of a systems strategy, not just some kind of shiny new bauble AI thing on its own.
And when I was doing a little research on Neo4j before you joined me today, one of the things that stood out to me was when the CEO of Klarna, when he shared on X that Neo4j introduced the business to the beautiful world of graphs as part of its shake-up of its entire data strategy. And they've been in the headlines quite a bit with how they're using technology. So for anyone that's not seen this, can you just share how Klarna's operations have been transformed with AI and knowledge graphs and how it's working so effectively for them?
Yeah, for sure. So there's a bit of an interesting backstory on this one. So Sebastian, the CEO of Klarna, had been sort of thinking over how his business would work for the long-term future. And the kind of mental model that he came up with was, turned out of entities connected to other entities. And as it turns out, we know that data structure. We call that a knowledge graph. And then there was a bit of locality that I think sort of played in here because Klarna is a Swedish tech company. And actually, not a lot of folks maybe know this, but it's also a Swedish tech company. We started the business in southern Sweden in a town called Malmö, which is just across the water from Copenhagen. And so our CEO and their CEO know each other through Swedish tech circles. And that was the spark really that gave life to this. And not at all to diminish achievements. What they've done is phenomenal. They've embedded both AI and knowledge graphs at the core of their thinking and have been able to replace numerous third-party systems by doing so. But they are simply just further down the road than many other folks. And what that means is other folks should not be discouraged from this idea of deploying knowledge graph powered agents into the same places that Klarna have already demonstrated that they can do so. For example, Klarna have already demonstrated that a lot of their customer service work can be very reliably taken care of, and by the way, across multiple languages and products, by using a knowledge graph that represents the way their business works, along with a foundational model, allows them to translate that into various human languages so they can have an excellent experience with their typically tech-savvy users in this case, right? Klarna appeals to a young tech-savvy crowd. But what they've done, in my mind, is they've shown the way, right? They've done the hard yards to show, we've gone this far down the road on this journey and they're continuing. And so it's safe for others to follow. So the deployment of knowledge graphs and large language models is a done deal. We've seen how it can be done. I think what's more interesting and probably a bit more controversial is that Klarna kind of said almost as a side comment that they have also replaced Salesforce going this way. And in fact, that made it all the way up to the Salesforce CEO at their conference this year, right, which caused a bit of a stir. And then Sebastian, again, the Klarna CEO, was at pains to say that that's probably not a general trend. And look, he's probably right. Klarna have a workforce of extraordinary technologists building their system, and not everyone has the kind of Klarna workforce that they can depend on. But what it does show is that even core business systems or SaaS systems that you might rely on are now within the reach of knowledge graphs and AI in a way that, 2 years ago, that would have been unthinkable. So I think this sends really two strong messages out to the market and the technologists in it. So one, a whole bunch of stuff has been commoditized, right? Chatbots and so on, commoditized. Now you can do that. Two, there's a whole bunch of higher value stuff that's potentially up for grabs that wasn't, a year or two ago. And I think that's going to be really interesting, right, to see where other folks take this.
Neo4j has indeed been credited with lowering barriers to graph technology with your Gen AI Copilot and 15x read capacity. It's also been used by the entire company to supercharge growth. But as we look further ahead and AI continues to evolve, what are the biggest challenges and opportunities in integrating agentic AI with real-world business applications? Just to bring this to life and give maybe business leaders listening some valuable takeaways. What excites you here?
Yeah, you bet. So look, I'm going to beat the drum again, Neil, but I think, AI is extremely, extremely compelling, right? And everyone it has had their head turned by it. It's the first time in my professional career, and as I sit here, I'm now officially old, but it's the first time in my career I've ever seen CEOs demand a tech strategy. It's a remarkable thing. I've lived through a lot of businesses, a lot of technologies. The CEO never cared. As long as the computer switched on in the morning, they could get their email. That was all they needed. Now the CEO is telling us all, you need to have a strategy for AI. And that is both amazing and also troubling. Because what's going to happen now, if the CEO puts enough pressure on you, you're going to develop a strategy for AI. But that's like building the house without foundation. You need to have an AI strategy that isn't going to damage you and your reputation. You first need to get your data in order, or at least that part of the data that is pertinent to your AI. Please don't boil the ocean. And I would respectfully suggest, and forgive my biases because I do love graphs and I do work for a graph company, but thinking about some of your AI critical data and forming that into a knowledge graph to be able to support your AI deployments is the right order of things to do, because you'll get value from that graph data first. As soon as you start putting data into a graph, you start to accrete value from it. And the more data that goes in, the more value you get from it. It's ironically, I can say here, that's part of the network effect of graph data. But graph data is categorically the best underlay for your AI activities. So please don't go out into the AI world, underpowered with respect to data. Think about your data strategy. Think about how you're going to develop a knowledge graph to support your AI. Bring that knowledge graph into production with your AI solution and then reap the rewards.
Wow, I think that's a powerful moment to end on. Thank you so much for sharing your invaluable insights with me today, and indeed everyone listening. And before I let you go, on a personal level, obviously you've enjoyed a fantastic career, and none of us are able to achieve any degree of success without a little help along the way. Very often somebody somewhere sees something in us, spends a little time with us, or maybe helps put us on the path that we're on today. And these people are often blissfully unaware on that scale of the impact that they've had on our life. So who are you grateful towards that maybe helped you in your career that we can give a little shout out and a little thank you to today?
Numerous people have helped me along the way. That's for sure. But as I mentioned, I'm a boy from the Black Country. I'm the first generation of my family that had actually got any education past high school. And the person I'd really like to call out to would be a chap by the name of Professor Pete Lee, who's a professor at Newcastle University. And Pete was my PhD supervisor. And without doubt, he sculpted me from being a rather wet behind the ears, green young researcher into being someone vaguely competent. And so I would really like to thank Pete for all the help he gave me all those years ago. And I hope he has a very happy retirement to get over having to coach me through that PhD all those years ago.
Oh, wow. Love it. And hopefully, if he is enjoying his retirement, he will get a chance to listen to this podcast, drinking a cup of tea, hearing about the impact that he had on you. A big shout out and a big thank you. And I think it's so important to recognize people that have had that impact on us, because very often they're very selfless people that don't do it for any recognition at all, and probably unaware, as I said a few moments ago. So big shout out there. And for anyone listening, wanting to dig a little bit deeper on Neo4j and any of the topics we talked about, where would you like to point everyone today?
Well, I think the first thing you can do is just pop over to the J website. That's at neo4j.com. If you're a developer, you'll find a whole bunch of nerd stuff that will help you get your nerd on with graphs. If you're a business person, there's a whole bunch of business use cases and things that you'll find that would enable you to understand what your nerds are talking about. So head over to neo4j.com and we'll take the conversation from there.
Awesome. I'll add links to everything that you mentioned there and a few other of the social channels. So I do urge people to check that out. And we covered so much in a short amount of time today. So just a big thank you for shining a light on this and just talking about it in a language everyone can understand. Pure gold from my side. But thank you for joining me today.
Thank you very much indeed, Neil. It's been an absolute blast.
I think as the AI conversations continue to mature, Neo4j's work reminds us that intelligence, whether it's artificial or human, is only as good as the context that it understands. And graph technology offers that context in a way that's both precise and scalable, turning noisy data into insights with real operational impact. From uncovering deceptive ad networks to powering the digital core of companies like Klarna, Neo4j is showing how a graph-first approach doesn't just enhance AI, it's helping businesses see their world more clearly and enabling them to act with greater confidence. So as these AI strategies begin to take shape across boardrooms, time to ask yourself, do your systems truly reflect the complexity of the world that you're operating in? And is your data ready to support the intelligence that your future will demand? As always, love to hear your thoughts. What role do you see graph databases playing in your business over the next year? Let me know. techblogwriter@outlook.com, LinkedIn, X, Instagram, just @NeilCHughes. But that's it for today. I'll be back again very soon with another episode. Hopefully you can join me again. But thank you for listening as always. Bye for now.